I'll invite our speaker for the afternoon and moderator for this block, Radhika Chadwick. She's a senior partner at EY and a co-founder of the Economic Singularity Club. Please.
Testing, can you hear me? I'll speak up. Well, thank you very much for coming here and making it here this afternoon. My name is Radhika Chadwick. I lead EY's work in digital and AI in government globally, and I have an enormous privilege of sharing this next panel with the books that are titled Economic Singularity Club. So, thank you. And for those of you who walk the extra 300 steps to this tent without knowing what it's about, I have a wonderful panel for you today. We've got Carl Frey, who is the Director of Programs on the Future of Work at Oxford University, also author of The Technology Trap, which is out next week. We have Jana Bennett, previously head of BBC Television for a decade, which I'm told is the longest-serving head of BBC Television ever. Followed by head of the History Channel, and now senior advisor to a number of different media and research institutions, including the Pew Research Center. We have Stuart Russell, who needs no introduction, professor of, but I will introduce him anyway, professor of computer science at UC Berkeley, and the gentleman who quite literally wrote the book on AI. In fact, another book coming out called Human Compatible, which is out in print in October, and I believe is already out on Amazon. And then we have Calum Chace, the AI guy, author of 6 best-selling books, including The Economic Singularity, and co-founder of the Economic Singularity Club. The thing that ties all of these people together is really a thread that they're all members of this Economic Singularity Club, which is a group of concerned individuals who meet regularly and have been meeting regularly for the past few years to discuss this topic, the topic of the economic singularity, which, as Calum defined it in one of his books, is the point at which society faces massive disruption on a global scale as a result of technological unemployment. Now, we have about 50 members, roughly. As a result, we don't really agree on much, but we do agree, generally speaking, we subscribe to the idea that AI-driven technological unemployment is a high likelihood, somewhere between a high likelihood and a certainty, depending on who you are, that the impact on our global civilization could be wonderful, or it could be quite disastrous. And most importantly, the decisions and the choices that we make now, as a business, as a society, and as a government, will shape which future we end up in. So the format for today is we'll hear from Carl for a few minutes, for about 15 minutes. We'll then hear from Calum, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and I'm happy, if we have time, to take a couple of questions from the audience as well. So with that, let me introduce Carl.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today and having the opportunity to share with you some thoughts from my recent book, The Technology Trap. Now, this may not come as a complete surprise to you, but we are living in a time of automation anxiety, where quite a few people worry about the tornado coming for the office. In fact, a majority of Americans, according to a recent Pew Research survey, now believe that governments should restrict the potential of businesses to automate away jobs beyond hazardous tasks. This may seem puzzling because when I was an economic history student, I was told that machines taking our jobs should be the very last thing we should worry about. Because for millennia, economic growth was slow and stagnant. The takeoff only came around 1800 with the first machine age, which allowed us to produce more with less and put us on this self-reinforcing cascade of progress that creating the modern world. People today have roughly 20 times higher incomes than they had at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. But looking at incomes alone even understates the improvements that have taken place. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, ordinary people could only look to the lives of the upper classes in envy, who had servants to do the most tedious things for them. Today, we all have access to the electric servant in terms of dishwashers, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, and so on, which makes our life a lot easier, not to mention other minor inventions like antibiotics and the automobile. And if that wasn't enough evidence of tremendous progress, think about the fact that earning those higher incomes and producing all of those new goods and services has become much more comfortable and interesting for us. Not so long ago, quite a few of us worked in coal mining, where explosions and cave-ins were frequent, lung disease often were a part of the work package, and those who worked in the factories were constantly exposed to the shafts and countershafts that threatened people's fingers, arms, and lives. Today, most of us work in air-conditioned offices. The last thing that's happened, or the worst thing that's happened at the Martin School, as far as I can recall, is when the coffee machine broke down. It was awful. And if you look at this transition to the modern office, that, if anything, understates the transformation that has taken place. Because a lot of jobs that existed 100 years ago are much more comfortable and convenient today. You can't sort of compare the job of a farm laborer who did, walk the fields with nothing more than animal power with a farm laborer today who sits in his air-conditioned tractor and listens to the music of his or her choice. So it's quite fantastic what technology has achieved for us. I'm here to tell you that, unfortunately, this is only half of the story. The long-run benefits of technological change have indeed been enormous, but the process to the modern world wasn't painless. In 1844, Benjamin Disraeli published a novel called Coningsby, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, in which one character remarks that I see cities peopled with machines. Certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times. In the very same year, in 1844, Engels published his work on the conditions of the English working classes, which was written during precisely a stay in Manchester. And he had a very different take on the Industrial Revolution, because he argued that machines only served to downgrade and deprive worker of meaningful middle-income jobs. Now, Engels, we all know, was wrong about the future, but he was actually right about the past, because for 7 decades, as the mechanized factory replaced the domestic system, wages were stagnant and even falling. If we look to consumption, spending on non-essentials declined, and the cords born in 1750 was actually taller than the cords born in 1850. A lot of people lost out to the Industrial Revolution. And the puzzle to economists and economic historians is, why would people have participated in the industrialization process if it actually reduced their utility? The simple answer is that they didn't. People petitioned to Parliament to restrict and ban the use of machinery. They expressed their thoughts and feelings in poems like the following one, and they on several occasions rioted against the mechanized factory. And how did British governments respond? By consistently squashing any resistance to progress. And I think it's important to remember that what began with the construction of the first factories and ended with the construction of the railroads also ended with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Revolutionary technologies brought a lot of political revolutionaries along the way. Now, I'm not here to tell you that we are going to live through the same experience. But income inequality has been approaching similar levels that we have seen during the Industrial Revolution. And the drivers of this is, like in the early days of industrialization, primarily technological change. It's not the spinning machines that replaced artisan workers, but computers that have allowed businesses to relocate production to low-income destination, and that has allowed us to automate away a lot of routine manufacturing jobs. Now, this has been really good for some of us, especially those of us who use computers in our offices, and that are able to reach a much larger marketplace where we export our ideas. But it hasn't been good for everyone. If you look at prime-age men with no more than a high school degree, they have actually seen their wages fall for 3 consecutive decades now. Now, we have already seen a backlash against globalization, but automation has had very similar effects. Where the robots are also the voters who opted predominantly for President Trump in the 2016 general election. Now, we have already seen this backlash against globalization, but the rise of China has already happened. And most people today work in non-traded sectors of the economy, meaning that they are relatively shielded from the impacts of trade and globalization. But they aren't shielded from the impacts of automation, and we have seen nothing yet. As artificial intelligence progresses, the effects of automation will become more pervasive. And when Adam Smith wrote about the division of labor back in 1776, he didn't envision this division of labor between us and machines. He envisioned a very different division of labor. But this division of labor has evolved much more rapidly in recent years than it has in the past. And much of this is due to big data, the progression of Moore's law, and clever algorithms, which allows us to automate a lot of things that were simply inconceivable only a decade ago. Automation is no longer confined to routine, rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code and readily automated. Machine learning allows algorithms to tap into our experience, learn through trial and error, very much similar to the way we learn. And according to my own research with Michael Osborne, this could potentially mean a watershed for labor markets. 47% of jobs are at high risk of automation, according to our estimates. And that doesn't just include manufacturing jobs, but anything from transportation, logistics, retail, warehousing, and services, and so on. There's no sector that is not going to be affected by this. The fact that 47% of jobs are potentially at risk of automation, though, doesn't necessarily mean that they will be automated away anytime soon. A lot of factors drive decisions to automate, but I think that the very underappreciated one is resistance to technological change and adverse public opinions. These are dock workers in Los Angeles who protested against the introduction of machinery just last week. And as I mentioned earlier, a significant share, in fact, the majority of people now believe that restricting the rise of the robots is a good idea. Now, I don't know exactly what the future holds, and I'm not here to predict the next wave of machinery riots. But I think that the economist Leontief was onto something when he suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. they might potentially have used their political rights to slow down the pace of automation. And as I argue in my book, resistance to technological change has been the historical norm rather than the exception. One reason why economic growth was so slow prior to the Industrial Revolution was not the lack of inventive ideas, but simply that craft skills resisted anything they perceived threatened their skills. And for the fear of social unrest, governments, for the most time, sided with the guilds. Now, I firmly believe that artificial intelligence is a good thing, that it has the potential to create a lot of wealth for us, in addition to goods and services we can't even think of today. But getting there will, again, require painful transition. And my message to you today is that we need to manage those short-run effects. Thanks for your attention.
Well, Carl's done a great job of outlining the scale and difficulty of the transition that's coming. But unfortunately, our political leaders are blindly ignoring it. They've got other things on their plates, like the rise of right-wing populism. And I think, and actually hope, that we will get past this soon. There's another very unhelpful idea out there, which is this meme that we're in the fourth industrial revolution, the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. We're at the beginning of something much, much bigger than a subset of the fourth industrial revolution. We're at the beginning of the information revolution. And it's going to have a bigger impact on humans than any of the revolutions that have impacted us in the past. In the distant future, that's not such distant future, we're going to need Stuart and people like Stuart's work to keep us safe from superintelligence and make sure we get the benefits of superintelligence. And in the shorter term, but the medium term, we are going to be facing the economic singularity. Now, anybody leading a tech giant at the moment is in denial about this. They'll say that automation in the past hasn't caused lasting widespread unemployment. Automation creates wealth, wealth creates demand, demand creates new jobs, and that has been true in the past in the long run, although, as Carl pointed out, not in the short run. But one thing we know is that past performance is no guarantee of future outcome. If it was, we wouldn't be able to fly. And we have seen massive widespread unemployment in the past, not in the long run for humans, because the past rounds of automation have mostly been mechanization. And when the machines took our muscle jobs, we had something else to offer. We had our cognitive skills. But it didn't work out so well for the horse, as Carl said. In 1915, there were 21.5 million horses working in America. It turned out 1915 was peak horse, and now there are 2 million horses in America. That is very serious technological unemployment. Thanks to Moore's law, which is evolving, not dying, as some people are saying, in 10 years' time, the machines we have will be 128 times more powerful than the machines we have today. There's no straight line between the processing power of machines and what they can do. There's all sorts of implementation issues, and we need the algorithms to develop and so on. But broadly speaking, they're getting a lot more powerful. In 20 years' time, if Moore's law or something like it continues, they'll be 8,000 times more powerful than they are today, and in 30 years' time, 1 million times more powerful. To me, it's fairly inconceivable that those machines will not take most of the jobs that humans do today. We don't know this for sure, but it seems quite plausible. It isn't going to happen tomorrow. It isn't going to happen in the next 10 years. What is definitely going to happen in the next 10 and 20 years is there's going to be a lot more churn. We have to get a lot better at working out how to reskill ourselves and reskill other people, and to deal with the people who fall by the wayside in that process. Jobs will change, tasks and jobs will change, but also firms will fail as they get disrupted. So there's going to be a lot of churn of jobs. But in the longer term, in the medium term, there is the distinct possibility of massive widespread unemployment. And to deny it, to say that it's not possible, I think is dangerously complacent. So we have to figure out what happens if we have a jobless future. Can we make that a wonderful future? And I think we can. The solution that I think is the right solution is going to sound a bit crazy, but I think it can lead to a really wonderful world, a world in which machines do the jobs, could be a world in which humans do whatever we want to do. We learn, we explore, we play. It turns out that being comfortably off and retired is really, really good. Being poor and retired sucks, but being comfortably off and retired is really good. So that's where we need to get to. And in fact, I think the people who insist that we will always have jobs, I think they are pessimists. There are, of course, one or two little problems, and the big one is money. How do we get enough money or resources to all the people who no longer have jobs? And a lot of people think that the answer is universal basic income, and I think they're wrong. I know that there's some profound disagreements within the economic singularity group about this. I think a universal payment is a pretty bad idea. I don't think it's a great idea to pay Mark Zuckerberg and his kids a great deal of money. But the real problem with universal basic income is the little word in the middle of it, basic. It means that at its best, universal basic income makes everybody poor. And we have to do much better than that. We have to make everybody rich. Now, how can we do that? I think the answer is the economy of abundance, also known as the Star Trek economy. And that is when we make the cost of all the goods and services that we need for a very good standard of living, let's say an American middle-class standard of living, we make the cost of all those goods and services nearly free. Not entirely free, because we want to keep the power of the market. The market is a fantastic mechanism for resource allocation. It's the best mechanism we know of. So we want to keep that. Now, this does sound crazy. I'm aware it sounds crazy, and of course people are leaving because it sounds crazy, fair enough. But we have seen some examples of it already happening. When I was young, which is admittedly a very long time ago, it was impossible, even for a rich person, to listen to all the music that they might want to listen to. And now it costs £10 a month. So can we replicate that across the rest of the economy? We can clearly do it with digital goods, weightless, easy to reproduce and so on, but can we do it for physical goods? Can we do it for cars and constructions and clothes? Can we have clothify and constructify and carify? Well, I think yes, we can. And we need to do three things to make that happen. Firstly, we need to take humans out of the production process, and that's what automation does, so that will happen. Secondly, we need to make energy very, very cheap. And this, again, is happening. Some people will tell you that it's already cheaper to use renewables than to dig up dead dinosaurs. It's not really true yet, but it will be true. The cost of solar cells is on an exponentially declining cost curve. Who knows, we might have fission within 30 years or so. Who knows, we may not. Fusion. But certainly, electricity is likely to get so cheap that it's hardly worth metering. And then the third element is AI will make our production processes much, much more efficient. They will enable us to find much cheaper sources of raw materials and to use less of them and less of them. So I think that through cost reduction, it is probably possible to have the economy of abundance. And I think the real threat is panic. I think if we're going to get the economy of abundance, it will probably happen as a natural process of our economic development. But if people perceive that technological unemployment is coming, and they don't believe that abundance is coming, there's likely to be a panic. And it might be that self-driving cars are the canary in the coal mine that cause that panic. When everybody knows 2 or 3 people who have been made redundant because very clever machines are now driving vehicles around, which is something we don't allow humans to do until they're adults, they may start thinking, well, actually, it's not going to be very long before they come for my job, whether they're an accountant or working in a factory or a warehouse. And when we panic, we do a number of things. We might all decide we'd better get our assets liquid, better we'll sell our houses before everybody else sells their houses. And we have the mother of all house crashes around the world. Another thing we do when we panic is we vote for very bad political leaders. Political leaders who tell us that they're going to take us back to a past which was glorious and has been stolen from us by the elite. And of course, they can't do that because the golden past didn't exist and it wasn't stolen. And that can lead to very bad outcomes. Now, about 3 years ago, Stuart Russell was in a conference and he made what may have been a sort of slightly throwaway comment, I'm not sure. But what we ought to do to prepare for this new world is get a bunch of science fiction authors and a bunch of economists and lock them into a room and not let them out until they'd come up with a plan for how to deal with this eventuality. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. I interpreted him to mean that we should set up think tanks. And so I thought we should do that. So Radhika and I decided to set up a think tank, and we called it the Economic Singularity Club, and to my great pleasure, Stuart agreed to join it. And we've given ourselves the task of trying to persuade more people to take seriously the possibility of technological unemployment in a generation or so. We don't know it's going to happen, and if it's going to happen, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we think it's possible, and we think we should be taking it seriously. So we're trying to recruit people to join the movement, the broad movement of people who take this idea seriously, because if we make the transition to the economic singularity successfully, we can have a really wonderful world, a world which could be wonderful almost beyond our imagination. If we don't, not so much. So let's take it seriously and get wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Calum. Can I invite Jana, Stuart, Carl, come join us for a little bit of a conversation and hopefully a flavour of what goes on at the Economic Singularity Club meetings. Thank you. So definitely quite a few common threads between Calum and Carl, but certainly some points of difference as well. Stuart, if I can bring you into the conversation just to get us kicked off, if I were to ask you, if and when we have human-level AI, what will humans be doing?
So I think human-level AI would, as Calum indicated, I call it everything as a service, right? So we can get a lot of things by tap, tap, tap on our cell phone. I can be in Melbourne tomorrow afternoon. I just go tap, 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 and tomorrow afternoon I'm in Melbourne. 2 centuries ago, that will be a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year, very high probability of death kind of thing, right? And with AI, pretty much everything that you need is going to be tap, 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 and it's available. So there could be a complete replacement of human participation in all of the supply chains of both goods and services. And it seems inevitable to me that humans will not be participating in large-scale production of anything. Because large-scale production involves, by definition, repetitive, routine processes, and where we have used humans as robots for thousands of years, and now we have real robots, so why would we use humans as robots? So the likely thing we're going to be doing, it seems to me, is person-to-person services, where we actually have a competitive advantage. And it's sort of a trick, right, that because we share so much of our nervous systems with each other, we know what it's like to be the other person. We lost the sound. So I'll project my voice. So we know what it's like to be the other person. And so, for example, if I want to know what it's like when you hit your thumb with a hammer, I can just hit my thumb with a hammer. I don't need a PhD in neuroscience to do that, right? Whereas a machine needs a PhD in neuroscience in order to know what it's like to hit your thumb with a hammer. It still doesn't really know what it's like. It has a description of what it's like, but not the experience. And so this means that in these person-to-person sorts of functions, we have a competitive advantage. And also the fact that actually for a lot of these functions, I don't want a robot doing it for me. Even something as simple as companionship at lunchtime. I don't want to have lunch with a robot. I want to have lunch with people. I want to be valued by people. I want to be comforted by people. I want my children to be inspired by people. So the problem with that is that many of those professions currently are extremely low wage. So you think about childcare. It's £5 an hour plus you can have some ice cream from the fridge. Right? Now imagine if you had, you had a broken leg, and you offered the orthopedic surgeon £5 an hour and some ice cream from the fridge to fix, to set your leg and fix whatever damage was done, right? That would be ridiculous. Why do we pay him well, I suppose not in the NHS, but in the US, £5,000 an hour to fix your broken leg. It's because he knows how to do it. Whereas the bored 16-year-old you're paying £5 an hour has no idea how to look after your children, right? Why does he have no idea? It's because our society has no idea. Because we haven't put in the effort to discover how to do it. We haven't put in 2 centuries of science, engineering, medicine, research to learn enough about human beings that we know how to look after them, that we know how to fix broken minds instead of broken legs. So if we're going to have a substantial economic role for individuals in the future, they're going to require skills and professionalization that currently don't exist because we haven't made them exist. So we need to start investing now in the human sciences. So President of Northeastern University, Joseph Aoun, calls it humanics. But this is a discipline that we've sort of left to wither on the vine, and the humanities have gone their own way. There is a potential, I think, to have a wonderful future where people are just much better human beings in the sense they are much better at improving each other's lives and enjoying their own lives. But these are skills that we lack in spades.
So you're talking about empathy-based jobs and the fairly large shift that we have to make as a society in the kind of work and kind of jobs that we value and the way we account for them, we pay for them.
Yeah, I would say, so when people say empathy-based jobs, they think about, the caring professions, the poor invalid who needs someone to look after them. But, think about executive coach, right? It's not exactly empathy, but it's an individual person-to-person service, and it's, the inequality in that relationship actually is in the other direction now. And so it could be much more like that. But generally, jobs that where an understanding of the other person's viewpoint is extremely important. Yeah.
Fascinating. Jana, can I bring you into the conversation? So I know you've got quite a lot of research material on how people are perceiving the rise of automation and the changes that are happening. Could you tell us a little bit about what your research shows and anything startling or counterintuitive that you might have run across in that research?
Sure. Is this on or both? Oh, okay, I'll just speak. So I regard myself as an absolute lay person in the Economic Singularity Club. In other words, I've just done, in a way, media, communications, and declaring the interest in I'm on the board of the Pew Research Center, where a lot brainier people than I are researching people's attitudes. And I thought that was interesting because one of the things about the Economic Singularity, in a way, think tank is looking at the gap between what members of the public might have around understanding or concern versus, let's say, the political class or policymakers. Because the wider that gap is, the less pressure, in a way, would be exerted on the political leaders to think about it or to do anything or to prepare. So it's an interesting area to sort of look at whether you might assume there's a high level of concern. Are people prepared for this revolution? Do they feel vulnerable, for example, or fearful? So I'm going to plunder some findings from the Pew Research Center, and you can get it all publicly. It's all for free on their fact tank website. You can look at all their studies because it's a nonpartisan Washington-based think tank, which is for the public to access on internet and technology. And a fellow called Lee Rainey leads this particular kind of stream of work. But the interesting thing from my point of view, Radhika's asking, is there anything counterintuitive? It's actually that the level of concern is actually quite low in my reading. So about 65% of Americans polled, about 10,000 person survey, only 65% thought that robots and computers will do much of the work currently done by humans within 50 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's quite a low figure, really, of feeling that you might end up being outsourced or replaced. 80% in the same study thought the jobs they were currently in, they would actually exist in some form in 50 years' time. And given what we think the projections are in terms of the ability to replace jobs, again, that's quite a high figure of either denial or confidence that you will not be replaced. Only 15% of workers said their employer could use technology to replace the job they're currently doing, and 85% said it wouldn't be possible. And even managerial class workers, only 9% thought their jobs could be replaced by technology. So a lot of people thought they were very special. And maybe that's very much a human tendency to think of yourself as a singular, economic singularity. That you're kind of special, and of course they can't change, nobody could do my job. And that was including, in particular, college-educated, the higher-educated worker felt they were more irreplaceable. And again, I just think that just is interesting to see, whether it's particularly American or not, I don't know, but interesting to see that that is where the bulk of this cross-section are in terms of mentally being prepared for a future that's coming at them pretty fast. And I haven't seen this, but my guess is that they're probably more worried about being replaced by cheap labor, such as from China. That is probably an area of greater concern than automation and robotics, for example, or AI. So it's a bit counterintuitive, that finding. I would have thought it'd be a higher degree of fear or, kind of vulnerability. They're just not all that worried so far. Yet in somewhere like South Korea, where there are more than 600 installed industrial robots for every 10,000 workers, there's a higher level of belief that you could be replaced by AI or robotics or automation. In the States, only 200 out of 10,000 workers have installed industrial robots, and yet the hourly cost of robots $4 versus a manufacturing worker in Germany being $49, in the US $36. So there is an economic logic at work here, which maybe isn't as well recognized as it could be. And this is one of the international surveys. So those are the things I thought were kind of interesting about the, what's going to happen around dislocation. And I actually agree about if you start to know people who've been replaced by, let's say, driverless cars, you will start to, through almost like your local common sense knowledge, start to realize stuff's happening. But perhaps when that hasn't happened yet, you just end up thinking, it doesn't apply to me. So those are the main, I can also share these as slides. Sorry, I don't have slides. But that's, to me, the kind of in a nutshell where the US worker might be right now, and where other countries like Argentina and Greece, for example, really believe that AI is a threat. Why? I really don't know, but it's kind of interesting, particularly Argentina and Greece.
Interesting.
So interesting by different countries how bumpy it will be.
Yeah, fascinating. So, I guess we're learning that we need to move quite rapidly towards a person-to-person style economy, and yet the level of understanding awareness is quite low. Let me just open this question out to anybody, or really two questions. One is, what sort of timeline do we think that this will play out in? And secondly, how do we make sure that the future benefits are widely shared, or as much as can be?
So I don't think we have any idea whatsoever about the timeline, to be completely honest. And the reason is very simple, right? I mean, these wonderful technologies that we have today, if they were everywhere, every country would be rich. And the fact is that there are enormous disparities in technology adoption across countries. And the main reason for that is that technological change often comes with what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. There are always losers in the progress to technological change. And often the losers are busy building coalitions that restrain the introduction of new technologies in one way or another. Now, that is one of many factors, but it's important to note that accelerating innovation is not the same thing as accelerating technology adoption. Now, you have a lot of studies that People argue that the smartphone spread much faster than the steam engine. Yes, that's true, but the smartphone is a consumer good. The steam engine is something that was applied in production, that required organizations to readjust, that required the reskilling of people, that was resisted in part by workers, that came with adverse public opinion. So we can't simply, extrapolate from what we see in the field of innovation to the sphere of technology adoption. And my sense is that most of this is going to play out in the sphere of political economy rather than in technology. And I think that there's been a lot of focus on globalization recently. People haven't been as concerned about automation. And I think that will eventually shift, because people are going to realize that when you hike up tariffs and jobs are not coming back, something is wrong. And as I mentioned earlier, most people today work in non-traded sectors of the economy. But truck drivers, receptionists, cashiers, they're not exposed to globalization, but they are exposed to automation. So my prediction is that this will very much depend on how we manage the short run. And the short run can be a lifetime for some. During the first industrial revolution, it took 7 decades for the great gains of growth to trickle down in ordinary people's pockets. And the Luddites, which are often portrayed as these irrational enemies of progress, they didn't stand to benefit from the introduction of new machinery. They were nothing of the sort. So later generations like us can be grateful that they were unsuccessful in bringing the spread of mechanization to halt, but it didn't work in their own interest, and I think that's important to remember.
I think it's absolutely right. We don't know when these events are going to unfold. We don't know when the milestones are going to be reached. And I think the consultancies, most of the large consultancies, are now issuing reports saying that by 2021 such and thing is going to happen, and 2023 such and thing is going to happen, and Middlesbrough is going to do worse than Grimsby because they've got a different mix of employers. And I think a lot of that is bogus. But there are some underlying trends which are there. The Moore's law has been pretty consistent, and the chip industry, Intel and NVIDIA and the others that are coming along are pretty confident they've got at least another 10 years to go just by shrinking the distance between the features. And then there's other types of chip archaeology coming along, construction coming along. So things like that are foreseeable. So we know there's going to be rapid change, and absolutely implementation can be very variable between countries and between industry sectors and so on. So I think we can sort of see the broad outlines, but not the detail. And I hesitate many times to argue with Stuart, but I'm going to argue with Stuart. I don't really think that the caring jobs, and I hope that isn't too pejorative a label for the whole thing, will remain immune to machine invasion. When humans do caring jobs for each other, very often what they provide is a simulacrum of caring. If you really cared with your soul, as you would about your child, for every patient that you see, if you're a nurse or a doctor or a childminder, you'd probably suffer emotional burnout within 3 days. You provide a simulacrum of care, and often, to be honest, not a very good one. Machines will always provide a good simulacrum of care, and they know how to do it really well. If they observe human behavior on a massive scale, they know exactly what really, really good care, the best care, they know what it looks like, and they have no problem providing it over and over and over again. And in Japan, where they have a growing an aging population, they don't really go in for immigration, and they're quite technophile, it turns out that elderly people quite like being looked after by robots. And it might be because you can tell a robot the same joke 1,000 times a day and it doesn't care. So I'm not convinced by this idea that our salvation lies in us all looking after each other. It may, but I'm skeptical. I think we need to at least think seriously about the possibility that there simply will not be any jobs for the majority of us in 30 years or so. And I think we need to think about, if that happens, and it's a big if, but if it happens, how to make that a great world, and I think we need to do a lot of scenario planning. And as I say, the only solution I can see to that is abundance, because I think it's only if we have abundance that we can make the taxes that the rich people will have to pay, those still in work and those with assets, i.e. Mark Zuckerberg, it's only by having abundance that we can make those taxes not so onerous that Mark decides to go and live in the Cayman Islands and surround himself with a big wall with lots of cameras and guns.
Stuart, would you like to defend yourself?
Let me briefly say something else about timeline. I think it's certainly hard to predict the arrival of human-level AI because that requires multiple conceptual breakthroughs that are nothing to do with the predictable advance in computer power or disk size or anything else. When you look at the advances that have happened in the last decade, particularly things like computer vision, I would say there are not that many corporations for which object recognition in visual images is a huge part of their business process. But I would say that the ability to understand language is actually much more commonly part of the business process for many, many corporations. And I think that capability is advancing rapidly now, and I think we may see some significant breakthroughs in the next decade. And I think that'll have a much bigger impact in terms of commercial incorporation. So that will be the area where I think we might see significant and then reductions in employment for verbal workers, let's put it that way. And then, self-driving vehicles, it's slow, it's difficult progress, but I think the people have put too much money into it to give up that easily. So I do think that will happen, but not, on a 12-month time frame like some of the more optimistic predictions. They were talking about it in 2014. They were saying, "Oh, we'll be selling cars to the public by 2015." And that was a really embarrassing prediction to have made. Coming back to Calum's remark, I mean, I do think that, yes, eventually machines could provide many of the same interpersonal services that humans can provide. And at some point, we may want to decide that we should reserve certain occupations for humans and perhaps not build humanoid robots so that we're not additionally fooled by our subconscious reaction to the human form, which is very hard to switch off. And actually think about it that way, right? If see this styrofoam block here, right? I would have no problem switching that thing off. It's a styrofoam block. But if that was apparently a living, breathing, very human-like machine, it would be that much harder, particularly if I'd been talking to it for several weeks about my inmost feelings, to then just switch it off and take it to the dump and recycle it. These are not questions for the technologists to answer. I think we have to have a really important cultural conversation about how we want the future to look. And at the moment, the media thinks the future looks like a scene out of Terminator, and there isn't very much in the way of constructive vision.
So on that point, what I'd really like to do is, I know we only have 2-3 minutes left, I'd love to get a vision from each of you of what a wonderful future could look like. But before we do that, I did promise to take one question from the audience. So if anyone has a burning question, jump up and down. If not, we'll yes.
So if people are going to replace their caring jobs with AI, does that suggest that people will also replace their friends and their other human interactions with AI? And if that's the case, presumably that's not the sort of future we want, and so we're going to need to coordinate to stop that in some way.
I'm glad you asked that. If machines replace us all in our jobs, if they replace all of us in all of our jobs, that does not mean that humans then become pointless. As far as we know, machines are not conscious. Let's hope that they're not, because if they are, we're committing mind crime on a massive scale. But so let's assume machines are not conscious, and they're not about to become conscious, at least until we get to AGI, which is probably many decades away. So the fact that we are the only conscious beings on this planet to the level we are, obviously cows, crows, dogs are conscious to a level, but you know, our consciousness is something that we, at least, we're a bit biased, we think is valuable. That doesn't go away. So our relationships with each other, which are based largely on that consciousness, you know, if I worked out for certain that you were a philosophical zombie and not conscious, I wouldn't really be interested in you anymore. So as long as we continue to believe that each other is conscious, then our friendships mean a lot to us in a way that they cannot with machines. We get very anthropomorphically fond of machines. As Stuart was saying, if that was a humanoid machine, it would be harder to be nasty to it. Men particularly get very fond of cars, so we can be anthropomorphically fond of machines even when they're nothing like humans. But the consciousness thing means that humans have a point that lasts well beyond machines taking over our jobs.
Thanks, Calum. Right, I recognize we've only got about a minute left, so I may not ask everyone, but would anyone like to paint a picture for me, or one or two people, the characteristics of a wonderful future that we ought to be keeping in mind as we make our choices?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of faith, in a way, in human beings being interested in the ethics of what should be set up, or as controls, or parameters for machine intelligence, or robots to not be able to just decide any old thing. And that's quite. I mean, we haven't probably set up enough of these tests, or controls, or panels, or whatever yet. But there's an interesting consciousness that is going to be important to serve humans. But the other side of this is a kind of bit of a tangent, perhaps, but not for me. It's about it's about planet Earth. If you think of the complexity of, let's say, something like climate change, the multifactorial inputs that are required, in terms of trying to process what you might need to understand in order to do something, it is beyond one human being's brain, and it's something ready for AI to help to work out how do you manage planet Earth on behalf of planet Earth, not just us extracting more resources. So I think I'm optimistic about that, because I think if you think of it as a caring set of jobs as well, us being stewards of environmental management and rewilding, perhaps, or all these things that are actually not so much about us, but about where we live. I think that is both potentially a source of new types of jobs, but also a very positive way of deploying AI, because a single computational thingy is not going to be able to cope with the complexity involved in all the things that go into making this a pretty remarkable place that we ought to really care for. So that'd be my optimistic and urgent way of thinking about how we use this for a better good.
And would anyone else like to add their pieces of their utopian vision?
Well, science fiction is the source of many of our stories, and normally it's dystopian, but there's some good, positive, upbeat science fiction stories, like Star Trek, like Ian M. Banks's series, which I believe Amazon is making a movie out of, or a series of TV programs out of, which should be great. The film Her, the film that actually Stuart was in, Transcendence, about a Berkeley computer scientist getting shot. That's in a way quite an upbeat vision. So there are some, because of what happened later, not because of the scientist getting shot. So there are some quite upbeat visions out there.
Fantastic. Carl?
Well, as an economist, I'm a big believer in the division of labor, and I'm the first to recognize that there are more creative people with more of a vision out there than myself to sort of take us forward. As an historian, I would say that I'm not too keen on 5-year plans that, create a common vision that we all move towards. I think that we have our separate visions often, and I think what we need to do over the coming years is to defend our democracy and the freedoms that are now under threat, to be able to pursue our separate visions.
Thank you very much. Stuart, I'm afraid you're the only one who hasn't said anything. Would you like to?
Well, I think I got to say a little bit of the vision at the beginning. And so let me explain a little more about the thing that Calum mentioned, the idea of getting economists and science fiction writers together. So science fiction writers, they are a synthetic discipline, right? They synthesize new visions of the future. But they're not analytic, so they don't necessarily, those visions don't necessarily make sense. They wouldn't actually hold together because of, the laws of economics would cause them to fly apart. On the other hand, the economists are an analytic discipline, right? There's no, you don't take an upper division course in, designing completely new economic systems. That just isn't a thing in economics. And so they're much happier perhaps analyzing proposals or predicting what would happen if we change this knob or this knob or this knob at the policy level. So that's why I proposed that we needed to put them both together in the same room so they can inject reality into the science fiction writers' wild imaginings, but we can actually have some imaginings. Because honestly, I think that the continuation of the current system and the status quo is going to result in increasing levels of inequality, where we finally get to a level, a very thin layer of capital owners, of technocrats. They will probably have a somewhat thicker layer of personal servants looking after them because they don't want to be looked after by robots. And then the rest of humanity can go fish, in quotes, right? It's honestly, I think it's hard to value, at least the way our culture works. It's hard to value yourself and your own life if nobody else values you. So, however we think about the future, and we don't have to have the traditional economic roles. It doesn't have to be that we're paying each other to have lunch with each other or something like that. But I think there has to be some system that involves mutual recognition of value. And it doesn't make sense to me that we would while away our years writing poetry that nobody else will ever read and painting paintings that no one else will ever look at or buy. I don't think that's how human beings actually work.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to our panel and pass it back to Hugo for